going to discuss a number of higher order cognitive functions, like the subject for our lecture today, language. Our goal in this lecture will be to review the evidence that very specific areas of the brain are going to play a role in both spoken and written language. Now, language involves higher order sensory areas and higher order motor areas, and that should make sense to you. For example, auditory areas are involved in the ability to interpret spoken language as meaningful. So this is going to be the function of a higher order sensory area. Motor areas are going to be involved in the ability to produce the specific combination of sounds that compose a given language and which are meaningful to any native speaker. So this means by definition that higher order sensory and motor areas are going to be involved. We don't just make sound and we don't just listen to noise. Language involves communication between one person and another. Now, our species appears to be unique in our ability to communicate symbolically through language. Other animals may communicate in very subtle ways, but we're the only species that actually communicates symbolically. Language is believed to be instinctual in our species, an instinct. And what are some of the reasons why neurobiologists and linguists believe this? Well, skeletal specializations have been identified in our earliest hominid ancestors that allow for speech. This suggests that language arose at the dawn of our evolution. Also, while an individual language, of course, is learned, the ability to recognize the individual sounds, which we call phonemes, in any language is present in humans at birth. So any baby at birth can hear all of the sounds that are made in any language spoken on the planet Earth. But the reason you speak Japanese if you're born in Japan is because you're exposed to a subset of sounds that make up the Japanese language. If you speak English, you're subjected to those sounds. So an individual language is learned, but human infants have the ability to hear, to make the distinction between phonemic sounds in all languages. Lastly, the left hemisphere shows specialization in the language areas we're going to talk about before birth. So we believe that all of these things indicate that language is instinctual in our species. Now, language is composed of a number of different elements. One of the things I find fascinating is that there are approximately 6,000 distinct individual languages spoken on the planet Earth. What I find even more amazing is about 1,000 of these languages are spoken in New Guinea. These are independent, separate languages. These are all the languages spoken on Earth, 1,000 of them in New Guinea. Now, each language consists of different phonemic sounds or individual sounds. And so English, for example, consists of about 50 distinct phonemes or phonemic sounds. For example, b and k. So these are not letters, they're sounds, b and k. So you think about words like bat, cat, and notice that those initial consonant sounds convey the difference between those two words. And that's very important. That one sound conveys the difference between two animals. Very, very different. Now, do you remember when we discussed that in the auditory system, that as you age, we lose the ability to hear higher frequency sounds? Well, that's unfortunate because what we fail to be able to hear as we get older are specifically the consonant sounds. And so that's why, as we get older, we have trouble understanding the words in songs and music and when we listen to the television set because we're not hearing the phonemic sounds that begin a word that give us the clue as to what the word means. So this is most unfortunate. Now, morphemes are the simplest arrangement of phonemes into a meaningful group. So, for example, a syllable is a morpheme. And simple words in a language are different and distinguished from each other by phonemes and morphemes, and they convey different meanings. And it's meaning that matters to us. That's what language is about conveying meaning. Now, words in turn make up sentences, and sentences are nothing more than temporal strings of words that have meaning. But the meaning in this case isn't just due to the individual words, but meaning is also conveyed by grammar and syntax. So, for example, all languages, each individual language has a specific word order. So, they have a place in the sentence where the subject, the verb, and the object will go. In English, that's how it is. It's subject, verb, and object. The order of the words in an English sentence conveys meaning. So, for example, in English, the boy looked at the girl. The girl looked at the boy mean two different things. And all the words are the same, just the order has been changed. And each individual language has its own word order. Language areas are found in the left cerebral hemisphere. We've talked about this before, that the left hemisphere is dominant, and the left hemisphere is generally dominant whether you're right-handed or left-handed. So we normally call it just the dominant hemisphere, but that is almost always the left hemisphere. These language areas play a critical role in our ability to speak and to understand language. There were two physicians, Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, who were among the very first to describe patients. They had specific disorders of language. And these types of disorders that refer to language are called aphasias. And this definition you now see on the screen is very critical. An aphasia is an acquired disorder of language. It means that the individual could speak and understand language perfectly fine and then had a stroke or some other kind of damage and now has some kind of problem related to language. And this distinguishes it from something like dyslexia and other types of disorders. So aphasia is specifically an acquired disorder of language. And it needs to be contrasted with something else because it's easy to get these confused, but a very important distinction. Aphasia is a disorder of language. It is not about articulation. So an individual might have difficulty articulating words because they had an injury to their face, because they have trouble moving their tongue a particular way. They might have some other kind of neurological problem that makes it difficult for them to articulate words. But that's not what we're talking about. Aphasia is a disorder of the higher order function of language. It means specifically being able to understand your native language and to be able to speak it normally. So it is a higher order function that is lost. So let's begin with one of the aphasias that was named after Paul Broca. Broca's aphasia is a motor aphasia, or called an expressive aphasia. And it is due to damage specifically within areas 44 and 45 in the frontal lobe, in the inferior frontal gyrus. If we looked back at a drawing of the brain, and this is the left hemisphere, Broca's aphasia results from damage right here to the area which bears his name, Broca's area, Brodmann's areas 44 and 45. An individual who has Broca's aphasia is very hesitant about speaking. It is language they can't speak. It's not really a problem related to understanding. It's not a problem in articulation. They have trouble speaking language. So they're very hesitant, and certain parts of speech are missing. And so if they want to go to the store or something, they might say, "Go store." And it's very hard for them to communicate with language. Something seems to be wrong in the motor aspect of being able to speak language. And over time, individuals with these disorders that involves Broca's aphasia become mute. So the individual basically stops speaking. They no longer are able to communicate in spoken language. Now, let's contrast that with the other type of aphasia, which is named after the other physician, Carl Wernicke. Wernicke's aphasia is a sensory or a receptive aphasia, and the disorder is due specifically to lesions that are found in damage to area 22 of the temporal lobe. So let's look at where that is at. And here is Wernicke's area right here, Brugmann's area 22. Now, one of the things I want you to notice, Broca's aphasia is a motor aphasia. It's an expressive aphasia. Notice it's in the frontal lobe, which is where all those motor areas are located, right? So you can remember it that way. What is down here? What primary area is down here in the temporal lobe? The auditory area. And Wernicke's aphasia is specifically an aphasia, a receptive aphasia, in that an individual now can't understand language. So this individual can speak perfectly fine, but they no longer understand what other people say to them. It's a very interesting kind of thing. Broca's patients can understand what's said to them, but they can't speak language. The Wernicke's patient talks non-stop, but nothing they say makes any sense. It's almost as though when the words come out of their mouth, they can't understand language, so what goes into their own ear doesn't make any sense either. So, for example, in a physician's office, if an individual had a stroke involving this area, Wernicke's area, you might ask the individual something like, do you know why you've been brought into the hospital today? And the individual might say, the sky is blue and the dog had a pink collar on. And furthermore, there's a candy store down at the end of the, and they talk nonstop, but it doesn't make any sense. And it has nothing to do with what you said to them. You can imagine the difficulty in being a family member and the dynamics of the family and how it changes with people who have these kinds of aphasias. Now, obviously, in normal individuals, we hear language spoken to us, and Wernicke's area is connected to Broca's area, and that should make sense to you. Obviously, if someone says, well, do you know why you're brought into the hospital? If you make an appropriate response, it means you understood what was said to you. So the areas are connected, and there's a different type of aphasia that occurs if that connection between the two areas is lost. So there are many different kinds of aphasias. One of the things I would like you as my students to notice here is that, do you remember that most of the lateral aspect of the hemisphere was supplied by a single artery, and that's the middle cerebral artery. So it turns out that individuals who have strokes that involve major branches to this lateral aspect of the cortex and the middle cerebral artery can have both Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia, which mean they can no longer speak language and they can no longer understand language. And this can be utterly devastating for the person and their family. Now, we mentioned previously that one of the shattered sort of paradigms in neuroscience was that language is exclusively a left or dominant hemisphere function. So yes, indeed, Broca's area and Wernicke's area are indeed found in the left or dominant hemisphere. But you know what we sort of wondered is, what is Broca's area in the right hemisphere doing, or what is Wernicke's area in the right hemisphere doing? And what we have discovered is that even though the left hemisphere is dominant for language, the right hemisphere, in fact, plays a very critical role in language. What is the main function of language? The main function is communication. So what does the right hemisphere do? Well, the right hemisphere is predominantly involved in prosody. Prosody is intonation and the sing-songy nature of a language. And each language has a sing-songy nature to it. When you hear someone speak French, you hear someone speak Italian, you hear someone speak English. There's different kinds of lilting intonation and rhythm to the languages that are spoken by a normal speaking person of that language. So prosody is very important. It's also one of the ways we convey meaning. Jeanette, sit down. Jeanette, sit down. We convey meaning in an emotive way when we use different kinds of rhythm and inflection in our voice. So it is also one of the ways that we communicate. Now, interestingly, lesions in the non-dominant hemisphere, that would be Broca's area in the dominant hemisphere, speak in flat tones. So the individual doesn't have the sing-songy and doesn't inflect. The person who has the comparable area that would be Wernicke's area, but in the right hemisphere, doesn't understand the emotive communication that takes place when other people speak to them. So when someone else speaks to them with that emphasis or with some kind of inflection or in a particular way, the person doesn't understand that emotive element. So in fact, our right hemisphere, our non-dominant hemisphere, plays a very critical role in communication. And that's what language is really about. Now, another paradigm that has been sort of shattered in modern neuroscience relates to people who sign. And this is kind of interesting. I once offered a course to teach medical students how to sign to patients who were deaf. And people have a misconception, and neurobiologists had a misconception for a long time. And that was, it's been known for ages that the left hemisphere appears to be dominant for language and for analytical ability. So people who are physicists tend to be very left hemisphere dominant. Also, the right hemisphere was thought to be more involved in things like spatial properties. And so the hemispheres were seen in that particular way. So the conclusion was reached that individuals who use sign language, which means they use space in front of them and move their hands, that signing had to be a right hemisphere function. Well, it turns out that's not so. Language is language, and the brain doesn't care what medium you use to communicate or to use language. It's a left hemisphere dominant function. And in people who have never spoken and who use sign language, use the same Broca's in Wernicke's area that individuals who speak language. So what happens in these individuals? If a person who is a signer has the Broca's area compromised, then that individual is halting in their signing, just like the person who has Broca's is halting. If they have a receptive aphasia, on the other hand, Wernicke's area is involved, then they can no longer understand the signs that someone else is making to them. So, in our species, the left hemisphere appears to be specifically designed to use language, to do what's necessary to allow us to communicate. Now, up to this point, we've been focusing primarily on spoken language, but we, of course, do have another type of communication, and that's written language. Now, unlike spoken language, written language is an invention, not an instinct. It's an invention. We have a number of different areas, however, that have been implicated in written language, and this is very important. But before we get to those areas, I want to point something out to you because I think this is very, very important. Written languages rely on pictures to represent words, or we have alphabets. That's what we use now. But every neurologically normal person on the face of this planet learns how to speak language. But not every person on the face of this planet will ever learn how to read or write. And in fact, if you looked at our planet as a whole, you would see there are far more individuals who do not read and write. But every single neurologically normal kid will learn how to speak language. Language is an instinct. Spoken language is an instinct. Or if their parents sign to them, whatever language they use, that will be an instinct. Written language is an invention. But there are also some other differences which I think are very important. What we've learned is that in spoken language, the left hemisphere is actually designed to abstract the set of sounds that are being spoken in that particular language. So in spoken language, while the baby's brain can understand the phonemic sounds found in any language, the language they're exposed to, the brain abstracts that particular set of phonemic sounds, the 50 phonemic sounds of English, for example. Now, individual sounds make up the language. So this is a part of the process of the brain doing what it's supposed to. The baby's brain also abstracts the rules of the language. So the word order, for example. So the baby's brain is designed to do this. Wernicke's and Broca's areas are designed to do what they do. And it's the abstracting of the rules that makes this an instinct. By simply hearing the sounds, or by simply seeing your parents sign over your crib, your brain is abstracting what these sounds mean, and more importantly, for any course in neuroscience, the brain is capable of mapping that sound to meaning. And that's what language is about. And that's what the left hemisphere appears to be specifically designed to do. Now, let's think about written language, though. That isn't what happens in written language. You have to be taught to read and write. There's no abstracting the general rules by your brain. You actually have to be taught to read and write. So what areas of the brain have we discovered play a role in the ability to read and write? Well, it turns out that there are two areas that are found in the parietal lobe in the dominant hemisphere, right here. These are areas 39 and 40 in the parietal lobe. If you have damage to these areas, they result in an acquired illiteracy. So it means a person who could formerly read and write has a stroke that involves that area, and suddenly they can no longer read or write. Notice again, they're also supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So massive middle cerebral artery strokes devastate the person's ability to have language. Now, finally, language in humans is not just about communication. Language actually helps us organize sensory experience. And this is something that's of great interest to neurolinguists who are very interested in these issues. Most obviously, we categorize objects in our world by words. And once that meaning's mapped to that word, you can't ever look at something and not see a table, or not see a chair, or not see a woman, or a cat. You can no longer do this. The word has been mapped to meaning in your brain, and short of neurological disease, you can't lose the ability. So this is part of what the brain is designed to do. So for example, when a child is very little, almost any small four-legged beast is a kitty or a doggy. And then as the child acquires language and the brain starts to map meaning to the words, now all of a sudden a doggy's a doggy and a kitty's a kitty. Just try describing what the real difference is that what your brain's picking up. Suddenly the child can pick up the difference between the two types of animals, and never again will they confuse a dog for a cat. Never again, of course, unless you have a brain lesion. There are actually people who have specific brain lesions who lose the ability to differentiate between a dog and a cat. There are people who cannot tell the difference between two different kinds of vegetables. They can't put the appropriate word with the object. Can't differentiate between different types of flowers. In addition, and this is sort of beyond the scope of this course, but people can lose very specific parts of speech. So, for example, when I was a student, I saw an individual presented to a class I was in who had lost the ability to speak, to read, or to write nouns. Only nouns. So instead of saying the sky is blue, he would say the is blue. No break, nothing. Nouns were just gone. And there are other parts of speech people can lose. There is nothing, there is no ability you have that can't be lost with the right brain lesion. And that's the point basically of the whole course. But it's very important to point that out. You can actually lose parts of speech. Notice also that thought has a lot to do with words. So if we're silent and we start thinking about something, notice in fact that it's words that are coming to mind. Think, I want to go to the store. And suddenly, or I want to move over to the brain model. And suddenly I move over and I touch my brain model. So internal thought has a lot to do with language. Now, the role of the brain, obviously, in both written and spoken language is considerably more complex than what we have time to cover here. One of the things we're learning is that there are habitual ways we learn how to speak. So people say, and there are people who have different kinds of patterns or habits. Well, it turns out it looks like the extrapyramidal motor system takes over there. And so without even thinking, these language areas don't even need to be called into play anymore because the individual just responds habitually a certain way to something. And remember those motor programs in the extrapyramidal motor system? So people who have lesions in the extrapyramidal motor system often lose habitual ways of speaking and interacting with other people by language, which is very, very interesting. Now, one of the last areas which is of great interest to neurobiology and also to interest of people that are interested in neurolinguistics will be people who are bilinguals or people who speak more than one language. So how the brain acquires the first, second, third languages, whatever, how you acquire these languages seems to be dependent on age. So in normal individuals, we acquire our first language when we're babies, obviously. This is when our brain is designed to do this, and it's working overtime to do so. Now, if very early in development, you're exposed to other languages, and I actually have a marvelous example for you. There was a secretary in one of the departments at Vanderbilt who was Danish. She had a little girl, and she never spoke anything to the child but Danish. Her husband was French, and he never spoke any words to the child except French. And everyone else in the world that she lived in spoke English to her. Well, initially when she was very little, she's 2 years old, she's starting to babble, okay? She's getting all the languages mixed up, and she's got a word for this, and she can't think of another word for that, but she talks nonstop, because she's 2 years old. Well, then a miracle happened. Somewhere about the age of 4, suddenly if she was speaking to her mother, she spoke only Danish. She was speaking to her father, only French. Speaking to other people, the babysitter, only English. Suddenly, her brain had separated these languages. Broca's and Wernicke's are capable of hearing the sounds in any language, capable of abstracting the rules of any language. And when you're young, we really don't know how many languages a person could potentially learn. But what happens is that as we age, something occurs in the brain, and this occurs after puberty. And we'll talk a little bit about some changes that take place in puberty. But what happens is that as you age, you lose the ability to have these areas abstract the rules. Now you have to study language. Now you have to bring your hippocampus and memory into play. Now you have to read the word. And notice what you do when you learn a second language as an adult. You look at the word, and they tell you that hello is hola in Spanish. And what do you think? Oh, hola means hello. No, hola means hola. To a child, they don't translate it into some other language to understand what it means. It just becomes mapped to meaning in their brain. So how we learn second languages is different. And also something happens around puberty. An interesting sidelight that has happened, which is just really fascinating, is there was an evolution of a new language. And by the way, little children who are signers, when they're about 2, they use their hands and they just babble, just like little kids who speak language. I mean, it's fascinating. But before 1979, in Nicaragua, there were children who were deaf, who didn't understand spoken language. They were deaf. And these children, I believe, were orphans. And they were all brought together, and there were about 500 of them from different areas of Nicaragua. And these were young children. These children initially could not communicate with each other, and what happened over time is they developed a full-blown, brand new sign language that had never been seen on the planet Earth. And it had syntax, it had order, it had meaning. So language, this incredibly unique capability that we alone as humans have, helps us communicate with others, organize our sensory experience. We can communicate to other people our feelings. We can try anyway. This is just an incredible capability that we have. And short of brain damage, you will always be able to communicate in this fashion with other people. So it's just an incredibly wonderful capability that we have. Thank you.